Alright, hey class. This is a video to kind of bring in and introduce Chapter 5, which is mostly, as you can see by the title, about biodiversity and the evolution that has led to that biodiversity. So just some terms, and you should be familiar with a lot of this stuff from your previous class in biology, but as you probably know and you can see from this picture, there are different types of diversity. Ecosystem diversity is basically the different types of habitats, biomes, if you will, microhabitats that can exist in a certain region. And then species diversity is referring to the composition of species. So that's what most people think about when they hear the term biodiversity, is the actual species. But there's also, at an even smaller scale, is genetic diversity, which is when you're looking within a certain species, so chipmunks here, what are the differences between the individuals in terms of their genetic makeup. So some populations, some species have very high genetic diversity, like humans, for instance, and some have very low genetic diversity. Cheetahs are a great example of that. They're very similar to each other, and that leads to them to be vulnerable to extinction and not being able to adapt to different environmental conditions. Okay, so a couple terms that we're going to be going over in class and also be using in our lab, our biodiversity lab outside. The first is species richness, and this is a term to describe the number of species in a certain area. So species richness of this community here is 4. There are 4 different species. Okay. There's another term, however, that refers to the evenness, and it's basically the relative abundance of each of these species. So you can see in this community, the evenness, there's complete evenness. Each species is represented by a 4th. Okay. Here, it's very uneven. One species dominates with 70%, and the rest have very few in comparison. Okay, when you combine these 2 parameters, the richness and the evenness, this is what is regarded as species diversity. Okay, so although these 2 communities have the same number of species, the same species richness, they have a different level of diversity because they have different evenness. Okay, which do you think might be the most diverse? Well, we'll talk about it in class. Well, I can't. The one that, if you have the maximum level of evenness, you have the maximum level of diversity for a certain number of species. The more uneven you get, and this makes sense, I think, intuitively. Imagine if 99% of the species here, or 99% of the individuals were of one species, and you had very few of the others. That would not be very diverse, right? But when it's even, it's a more diverse community. Okay, so getting to evolution, the change, basically the term in general, is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time. So how do species evolve? How do entire communities evolve? There are lots of different ways that we're going to go into, and there are 2 kind of types of evolution, 2 broad types. Microevolution, as depicted by this little guy here, is when you look at a given gene pool, a given population over time. It doesn't result in new species, but a certain species may change in color or size over time, and this we've seen in many different instances, and particularly around here, if you look at the squirrel populations, they're becoming much more diverse. They have lots of different colors, and macroevolution is kind of on a much longer time scale, and it's when you get new species or even new genera, phyla, etc. Okay, so micro is just within a species, and then macroevolution is looking at the rise of new species. Okay, so just some kind of background terms that I know you guys have learned. So genes basically are the different sections of DNA on chromosomes that code for certain traits. Okay, the genotype is the makeup of those genes. Okay, so it's a complete set of genes. A mutation is kind of the changing of your code that would then lead to a different phenotype. So the phenotype is the physical expression of a genotype. Okay, and mutation in a genotype can often lead to a phenotypic alteration, not necessarily, but those mutations are very key when we're talking about the theory of evolution. Okay, so different types of evolution. Evolution by artificial selection, and humans have been responsible for a lot of artificial selection. Dogs, different breeds of dogs, is a very interesting example, all being rooted with the ancestor wolf, and you get all these different breeds. You know, there are hundreds of breeds now. And humans have also done this with many plant species. You look at corn. The huge ear of corn that we see is not how it originally was. Humans have selected that over thousands of years to become something that is very desirable for us now. And then there's also, of course, the evolution by natural selection. So this is when the environment not us. Okay, so the environment is what's determining which individuals are most likely to survive and reproduce. Okay, so of course Darwin is kind of the scientist who put a bunch of different ideas together to come up with this theory of natural selection. And as I'm sure you know, he used his observations of finches in the Galapagos to kind of generate some ideas about, how is it that all these finches in a very small area, but yet on different islands, have all these different traits, different size beaks, different size bodies in general. And he was able to kind of think that perhaps this idea that individuals that have more favorable genetic traits are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce, and over time this will somehow change a species, a population, so much that they might become a different species altogether. So let's look at the mechanisms, the more specific mechanisms behind this, and kind of the conditions that need to be in place in order for natural selection to take place and for evolution to therefore occur. So one thing that he noticed was that individuals produce an excess of offspring. This is more evident and kind of more obvious in animals and plants too, of course. But animals, you think of fish and how many eggs that they produce, and plants they produce tons and tons of seeds, but not all of them can survive. Okay, so that's a very important part of this, because they also differ in their traits. So not all of them will survive, but they differ in their traits. They differ genetically. So what is going to determine who survives? Well, it's not, sometimes it might be random chance, but in the theory of natural selection, those individuals that are better adapted to their environment are going to survive. And this is important, or the way that this actually can lead to evolution is because these traits can be passed on from parents to offspring. If that weren't true, then none of this would matter, because everything would be lost in each generation. And so that these differences in traits are associated with the differences in their ability to survive and reproduce. So if you look at this example, I kind of like so, but you basically have a bunch of different beetles. They differ in color. They're on our brown tree. So of course those brown beetles are going to be camouflaged, and the green ones are going to be picked off and eaten. So over time, this population is going to change to being more brown. And you might think, if you extend that for greater periods of time, eventually the population might not have any green beetles. So those traits that improve an individual's fitness are called adaptations, which I'm sure you've heard of before. But it's all about, what are the adaptations to a certain environment that enable an individual and a species as a whole to survive and thrive. And of course, the environment determines, or the best adaptation is going to vary from one environment to another, which is how and why you get all these different finches, because each island in the Galapagos had a different environment, and if there were a lot of seeds, large seeds on an environment, one island, then a beak that was larger, okay, like this guy here, would better survive but there's an island that has more insects or less seeds, so that the individual would have to feed on insects, then that size beak would be the best adaptation. So your environment really determines what the best adaptations are. And you can see how this would lead to evolution over time. And this is in your book, and it shows how these little crustaceans have their offspring, and let's say the ones that are the smallest are better able to survive because they aren't seen by fish. Okay, and so the next generation, there are proportionally more small offspring that survive, and when they reproduce, the chances that they have more offspring is greater because there are more of the small ones, and then again, the larger ones get eaten more regularly, and so over time, you're going to have a population that is going to be smaller individuals, because these larger ones selectively get eaten more, and the ones that survive and reproduce are small. Okay, so because the traits are passed on to their offspring, they are also going to be small. Okay, so in addition to natural selection, there is also evolution by random processes. So you may not have learned about this before, but it's very important, where you can get this evolution not because there's certain adaptations, but they're just kind of random things that happen in the environment. They're not related to fitness among individuals, but the genetic composition of a population can still change. Okay, so there are 4 different mechanisms that we're going to go over: mutation, genetic drift, bottleneck effect, and the founder effect. So some of these might sound familiar to you. So mutation occurs when you basically just get a random genetic mutation that is going to change the genetic makeup of a population. Okay, so this may or may not have an adaptation. For instance, you look at mice, black and white mice. Being one color or the other isn't necessarily going to be a good adaptation, but it can still change the makeup of a population just randomly. Okay, so this may increase over time, and that might happen more in small populations. So again, mutation, that isn't really an adaptation necessarily, but the population still changes. All right, so genetic drift is the change in population, or the change in the genetic makeup of a population. It happens more so in small populations, where you kind of get random mating, and the loss, so it's kind of the opposite of this mutation, but you get a loss of a trait over time because certain individuals just don't mate. So you can see here the black mice don't survive to this 3rd generation, and it's not by any reason aside from the fact that it doesn't look like if this is a dominant trait, then they must not have mated with any other mice, and so only the white mice are in this 3rd generation. So you can see that this probably would happen. The chances of this happening would be much greater in a smaller population as opposed to a large population, where kind of having a select type of individual mating and another type not mating is more likely when you have fewer to choose from. Okay, bottleneck effect, again, maybe